Okay, so this is going to be Chapter 13's new unit on evolution. This is how populations evolve, and the cartoon says you may find a few things have evolved since we've abducted you for our research. So everything is still evolving on the planet. All living things evolve. That's one of the traits of all living things. So let's take a look at what's in this chapter. The first subject that the chapter goes into is taxonomy. So you guys need to remember the name Carolus Linnaeus. Linnaeus is the Swedish scientist who introduced and devised our system of modern-day taxonomy. And what is taxonomy? Taxonomy is a branch of science, it's a branch of biology, and it's concerned with identifying, naming, and classifying species. So all living things can fall under a category based on their relatedness to each other. And there's different ways to figure out relatedness. Most recently, it's going to be DNA sequences, but there were other ways that people figured out, the lineages of organisms, and then they can be put into different systems. So you're going to start learning those systems, this taxonomy groups. Looking at taxonomy is this way, where you have really large groups of organisms where a lot of different kinds of organisms fall in a large group, but because they have one thing in common. And then as you narrow down the different groups, the organisms in those groups become more and more similar because you are going to filter out things that are not common anymore, or you're going to create groups that are more and more specific, and until you get to species, right? So for every living thing on the planet, there is one species of that kind of organism. And so that's going to be the smallest sort of unit that we describe, or the smallest taxonomy group, right, is the species, because you've narrowed it down to one kind of organism. So for the classification system, so if you're looking at your outline and we're looking at letter C, the groups of classification is going to be, you're going to have to memorize the order of these. So you're going to have to know that the very biggest group is called a domain. The second down is a kingdom, then phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So the way I did it when I was learning this in biology class was King Philip came over for good soup. So King Philip came over for good soup. Or any other way that you want to memorize it, but you want to know that as you go down in the taxonomy systems, right, the organisms get more and more similar. So if we look at this example here, we can see that domain eukarya. So that means that in this domain called eukarya, there are all living things on the planet that have eukaryotic cells. So if you think about what you've learned so far, what has eukaryotic cells in it? Plants are eukaryotic cells, animals, fungi, protists. So a lot of diverse different kinds of organisms fall under this domain because we all have eukaryotic cells. Then the next ratchet down, right, the next taxonomy group down is called kingdom. And the group of kingdom, now we have Animalia, so now it's all animals. And there are a set of, not rules, but descriptions of like what is an animal, right? How do you define what an animal is that exists? And you guys will learn that later on in the semester. But for right now, you have all the animals. Animals are not plants, right? And then if you go down to the Phylum Chordata, this gets even more specified. So animals include many, many things you probably don't even think of. Worms, of course, are animals. Insects are animals. Even sponges in the ocean are animals, and corals are animals. And, all the way dogs, of course. So there's lots of different kinds of animals. But in the Phylum Chordata, these are animals with a backbone. So if you think about jellyfish are animals, but jellyfish don't have backbones, right? So then we've narrowed down. So in the phylum, you're going to have all of the animals that have a backbone. And then of those animals, then you can narrow down even further and talk about, you can subdivide the phylum into classes. And classes, we're looking at the fox here, right? So there's a class called Mammalia. So these include all the mammals, right? Because if you think about animals with a backbone, that includes lizards and snakes. They have backbones, and fish, but they're not mammals, right? So there's another distinct category of class Mammalia, so get narrower. And then of all the mammals, then you have carnivores, right? The order of carnivores. So now you're narrowing down even more. There are some like deer, right? Deer are mammals, but they're not carnivores. And then the order, you can narrow down all out of all carnivores. They can look at just the canines. Then out of all the canines, you can just look at vulpes or vulpes, and then the species is our red fox. So let's look at another example of this, right? This is a little tricky because this is actually opposite direction. So here's our domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Carnivora, family Felidae. So now we have cats, genus Panthera, and species Panthera pardus. So is this true or false? Organisms in the same class are more related than those in the same genus. So organisms in the same class, so we're talking about all mammals, are more related than those in the same genus, so the panthers. So this is a false statement because of all the organisms in the class Mammalia, right? This is a very diverse class. You're going to have a lot of, they're related in one way that they're all mammals, but you're going to have very different kinds of mammals here, right? You're going to have the platypus is actually a mammal, and so are your leopards, and so are humans. But by the time you get down to genus Panthera, there are very few organisms in that Panthera genus because that refers to just our big cats, our panthers. So as you go down the taxonomy units, right, those classifications, you're going to get narrower and narrower with the amount of different organisms in them, and you're also going to get more and more related with those organisms. Here's another question. There are more varieties of organisms in the same order than those in the same family. Are there more varieties of organisms in the same order than those in the same family? And the answer is yes. There are more varieties of carnivores. Once you start getting into a family, right, you're subdividing, you're taking one of those carnivores and you're subdividing that, all the cats. Felidae is for cats, right? So your house cat and panthers and tigers and all those other cats fall into that category. All right, so the next topic is letter D, the binomial system. So whenever you see an organism in scientific literature or just, their scientific name is a binomial name. So let's take a look at this leopard, Panthera pardus, right? So the scientific name for this organism is two words. The first one is always going to be the genus, so the genus it falls into. The second one is going to be the species, all right? So there's only one in that species. There's only this guy that occupies that species. So another thing you need to remember is that the appropriate way to write this genus, species, organism is the genus is always capitalized and the species is always lowercase. And you have to italicize the word if it's in types. If you're typing out a paper, you have to italicize it. And to abbreviate it, I have that example. Oh, I have the example of Homo sapiens in your notes. So if you wanted to abbreviate Homo sapiens, for example, you would write the letter H, and then you always have to write out sapiens. You always have to write out the species name. So for Panthera pardus, you can put the big letter P, period, and then pardus. You got to write out the second name. You have to always write out the species name. All right, so how are all these cats related? We have the Panthera pardus, Panthera leo, Panthera onca, and Panthera tigris, right? So how are all of these cats related? Well, they're in the same genus, right? Panthera, 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 Panthera. So when you look at an organism's scientific name, you can see if they're in the same genus because the genus is always part of their name. All right, so we're going to stop here and talk about Charles Darwin in the next clip.